What are some weird encounters you've had with people, but then they completely vanished? I was driving late one night on a back road when I saw a hitchhiker. He looked harmless, just an older man with a long coat, so I pulled over. During the ride, he started talking about personal things he shouldn't have known, my childhood dog's name, the car accident I had as a teenager, even my grandmother's favorite saying. I was too freaked out to ask how he knew. About 20 minutes in, I turned to say something, and he was gone. The passenger door hadn't opened, and I hadn't stopped the car. To this day, I have no idea what happened. I was in the cereal aisle at the store, and an old woman approached me. She smiled and said, "You remind me of my son." We chatted for a few minutes, and she told me to take care of yourself in this strangely intense way. When I turned to leave, I realized I'd forgotten to grab milk, so I doubled back to the dairy section and saw her face on a missing persons flyer dated from 20 years ago. When I was 19, I took a train to visit my grandparents. During the ride, a woman sat across from me, and we talked the entire way. She was oddly insightful, giving advice about things I hadn't mentioned, like my upcoming finals and a rough patch with my mom. When the train stopped, she waved and said, "We'll meet again." But when I turned back to look for her, she wasn't there. No one remembered seeing her. A man knocked on my door one night, asking for directions. He had a calm, polite demeanor and asked about a street that didn't exist. I apologized and said I couldn't help him, and he left without a word. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow leading up to my door, but none leading away. I was walking my dog in a park when an elderly man sitting on a bench struck up a conversation. He told me stories about the area, mentioning landmarks I'd never heard of. I looked them up later, and they were all from the 1800s. I went back the next day to ask him more, but he wasn't there, and the park staff told me they'd never seen anyone matching his description. In college, I went to a party and started talking to a guy who seemed out of place. He wore a suit while everyone else was in casual clothes, and he had this old-fashioned way of speaking. We had a deep conversation about choices and regret. I turned around for a second, and when I looked back, he was gone. A friend later swore she never saw me talking to anyone. I was lost in a small mountain town during a road trip and stopped at a diner to ask for directions. A waitress was super friendly, drew me a map, and even gave me a free coffee. When I reached my destination, I told someone about the diner, and they looked confused. "That place burned down 10 years ago," they said. During a late-night walk, I passed a man standing on a bridge, staring into the water. He didn't seem distressed, just contemplative. I asked if he was okay, and he smiled and said, "I'm just waiting for the right moment." A little unnerved, I walked away, but when I turned back to check on him, he was gone. There was no way he could have left without me seeing. I used to take the subway late at night. One time I was sitting alone when a man sat down across from me. He said, "Don't get on the next train," then got up and walked away. I was creeped out but followed his advice. That next train had a derailment, and several people were injured. I was camping with friends and wandered off to explore the woods. I met a woman dressed in a flowing white dress who said she was a local artist gathering inspiration. We talked for a while, and she told me about a nearby stream that was perfect for painting. Later, when I mentioned her to the campsite manager, he looked shaken. He told me the description matched a woman who drowned in that stream years ago. I was walking home one night when a man approached me, asking for the time. He seemed ordinary enough, so I told him, and we ended up chatting as we walked in the same direction. He mentioned things about the neighborhood that only longtime residents would know, but I'd never seen him before. When I turned to say goodbye at my street corner, he was gone. He hadn't crossed the road or turned down another path, he just wasn't there anymore. When I was a kid, my family took a trip to a small town. I got separated from my parents in the local market and started panicking. A kind older man helped me find my way back, but before I could thank him properly, he disappeared into the crowd. Years later, I was flipping through old family photos and saw him in the background of a picture taken decades before I was born. I worked at a convenience store in my teens, and one night during a quiet shift, a man came in and asked for a very specific type of soda we didn't carry. He laughed when I said we didn't have it and told me I should try it someday. The next morning, I looked up the brand. It hadn't been sold since the 1970s. While hiking alone in a national park, I met a woman who seemed like a fellow hiker. She warned me about a dangerous trail ahead and gave me an alternative route. When I got back to the visitor center, I mentioned her advice to a ranger, and his face went pale. He said there hadn't been a hiker like that registered, but several years ago, a woman had died on the trail she told me to avoid. When I was in high school, I had a part-time job at a fast food place. A man came in late one evening and ordered a burger, but he kept staring at me, almost like he knew me. As he left, he said, "It's been good to see you again," even though I'd never met him before. When I looked outside, he was gone and the security cameras didn't show anyone entering or leaving during that time. I was at a park reading a book when a woman sat down next to me. She started commenting on the book, like she'd read it before, but she talked about plot points that didn't exist. I laughed it off at first, thinking she was confused, but when I got home, I found a note tucked into the book that read, "I hope you enjoy the ending." The handwriting wasn't mine, and the woman was nowhere to be found. I used to work the night shift at a hotel. One evening, an older man came in, dressed like he was from another era, asking if a specific room was available. When I told him that room didn't exist anymore, he looked heartbroken, apologized for the trouble, and left. Later, I found out the room had been destroyed in a fire decades earlier. I was visiting a friend in another city and decided to walk around while she finished work. I stopped at a bookstore where an employee chatted with me about rare editions and gave me a great recommendation. When I went back the next day to thank them, the store owner told me no one by that name worked there, and the book one bought hadn't been on their shelves in years. One time I was waiting at a bus stop late at night, and an elderly woman sat down beside me. She started talking about my family, mentioning details she couldn't possibly know. I was so stunned I didn't ask questions. When the bus pulled up, she didn't get on. I turned around, and she was gone. At a college party, I met a girl wearing an old-fashioned dress. She was friendly and seemed out of place, but kind of captivating. We talked for hours. When I asked my friends about her the next day, no one remembered seeing her, and I couldn't find her on any social media. The weirdest part, someone later found a photo from the party, and there was no sign of her in the background, even though I know we talked right next to the group. I was walking downtown when a man came up to me and said, "You're going to be fine." I asked him what he meant, but he just smiled and walked away. Later that day, I was in a car accident, but I walked away without a scratch. I've never seen him again. When I was a kid, I had an imaginary friend named Tom. I stopped seeing him around age 7. But when I was 25, I was on a train and a man sat next to me. He introduced himself as Tom and said, "I've missed talking to you." I froze. By the time I could speak, he was gone. A couple of years ago, I was on a solo road trip. I stopped at a gas station and had a long conversation with a very friendly attendant about road conditions and places to visit. When I passed by the same gas station on my way back, it was abandoned, boarded up, and looked like it had been for years. While walking to work one morning, I passed an older woman who smiled at me and said, "Watch out for the red car." That afternoon, a red car nearly hit me when it ran a red light. I turned around to look for her the next day, but she was nowhere to be found. I visited a small antique shop in a remote town and chatted with the owner, a sweet old man who told me the story behind an old locket I bought. A week later, I passed through the same town and wanted to thank him again. The shop was closed and locals told me the owner had died years ago. I once had a neighbor who moved in for just a couple of weeks. He was very quiet, but every time we ran into each other, he would give me advice that seemed oddly specific, like don't take that job you're thinking about or call your mom tonight. After he left, no one in the building even remembered him moving in. When I was a teenager, a man approached me at the library and said he needed help finding a book. He handed me a title that didn't make sense, but when I looked it up, it matched a section about solving family conflicts, exactly what I was struggling with at the time. When I turned back, he was gone. I was jogging in the woods one morning when I came across a little girl picking flowers. She smiled at me and said, "It's a beautiful day for a goodbye, isn't it?" I didn't understand at the time, but later that day I found out a close friend had passed away. I went back to look for her, but there was no sign she had ever been there. I was at a train station late at night, waiting for the last train. A man in an old-fashioned suit sat down next to me and started talking about the war. At first, I thought he was talking about something recent, but the details he gave sounded like World War II. When I turned away for a moment, he was gone. The station was empty, and I never saw him board a train. While on a road trip, I stopped at a small diner that wasn't on the map. A friendly waitress served me and gave me directions to a scenic overlook. When I got there, I met a local who told me the diner had burned down decades ago, yet I still had the receipt with the waitress's name on it. I used to live in an old apartment building. One night, I heard someone knock on my door. When I opened it, an older man was standing there, smiling. He said, "I'm just checking in to see how you're settling in." I thanked him and closed the door. The next day, I mentioned it to the landlord, who told me no one lived on my floor besides me. In high school, I worked at a bakery. One morning, a woman came in and asked for a cake with a very specific design, a pattern of stars. She paid in cash and left. When I went to confirm the order later, it wasn't in the system, and no one else remembered seeing her. The order form had completely disappeared. I was walking home in the rain when an older woman offered me her umbrella. I thanked her and asked how I could return it, but she just smiled and said, "You'll figure it out." The umbrella was beautiful but old-fashioned, and when I looked closely, there were initials carved into the handle. They matched the name of someone who passed away in my neighborhood years ago. When I was backpacking through Europe, I met an older man on a train who told me about the town I was heading to. He gave me great recommendations and even described a specific cafe to visit. When I got there, the cafe owner told me he'd known the man but that he'd died years earlier. I used to jog early in the mornings, and one day I saw a little boy sitting on a swing in the park. He waved at me and said, "It's nice to see you again." I didn't know what he meant, so I just smiled and jogged on. A week later, I read a story in the local paper about a boy who drowned in that park years ago, and the photo matched him exactly. At a hotel I stayed at during a business trip, I ran into a woman in the hallway. She asked if I could help her find the elevator, so I pointed her in the right direction. Later, I found out there had been reports of guests seeing her for years. She was rumored to be the ghost of someone who disappeared from that hotel. I was at a music festival and struck up a conversation with a man who seemed really into a specific band. He told me all about their history, even claiming to have seen them in the 80s. Later, I looked him up online, and the band's lead singer had passed away years ago. The description matched him perfectly. When I was younger, I got lost in the woods near my house. A woman appeared out of nowhere and guided me back to the trail. She told me to be more careful next time. When I told my parents, they were confused. No one lived in that area, and the description I gave matched my great-grandmother, who had passed away before I was born.